I stood there frozen, rain soaking through my boots, as a stranger laughed from my grandfather's porch like he'd owned it his whole life. His girlfriend dangled her muddy sneakers over the edge, eating takeout like she didn't just throw 60 years of family memories in a dumpster. "Sorry, man," the guy grinned. "This is ours now." But he didn't know. Not yet. What that cabin really was, or who my grandfather had been. What would you do if someone took your family's legacy and dared you to stop them? My name's Jack Kowalski. And that was the day I declared war on a woman named Margaret Thornfield, a name I'll never forget. Let me take you back to where it started. My grandfather, Walter Kowalski, was the kind of man legends are written about. A Korean War vet who came home in 1953, bought 5 acres of lakefront wilderness for $800 and built a cabin with nothing but stubbornness and hand tools. He laid each log himself, mortared the fireplace by hand. When I was a kid, I used to run my fingers over the stones and feel like I was touching history. The place smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. You could hear loons on the lake in the morning and crickets at night. For decades, it was just Grandpa, his fishing rods, and the occasional FBI letter that came without return addresses. When he passed, the cabin came to me. I was living in Columbus at the time, helping Mom recover from hip surgery. Didn't think too much about HOA issues. I mean, it was always outside their reach. That place existed before they did. But that's the thing about predators. They wait until you're distracted, vulnerable, grieving. That's when they strike. Enter Margaret Thornfield, Whispering Pines HOA president, realtor, and tyrant in lipstick. Silver hair, glass-cutting voice, and the kind of smile that makes small kids hide behind their mothers. She didn't just run the HOA, she owned it. Every meeting, every rule, every shady decision ran through her salon-manicured hands. She had a son, Bradley, 30% criminal, 70% mama's boy, unemployed, petty theft record, the kind of guy who'd steal your lawnmower and then ask why you were being weird about it. Margaret wanted to buy him a future, and my grandfather's past was her ticket. It began with a letter, one of those crisp, certified envelopes that smells like perfume and trouble. Inside, a bill, $15,000 in retroactive landscaping. Assessments, improvements I never asked for, never approved, never saw. Due in 30 days. I nearly spit out my coffee. She followed it up with violations. Grass too long, mailbox wrong shade, suspicious late-night activity, because my army buddies stopped by with pickups. Every day was another notice. Margaret had made it personal. But the worst part? The whispers. Neighbors who used to wave now crossed the street. She spread rumors, PTSD, instability, dangerous veteran, she'd say with a fake frown. Margaret wasn't just playing legal games, she was erasing me, and I didn't even know why. Then I found out. Turns out Margaret's dad had tried to buy Grandpa's property back in the 80s for a fraction of its value. Grandpa not only refused, he helped the county prove Margaret's father was lying about his own property lines, costing him shoreline. That grudge, it passed down like a family heirloom. So Margaret had been watching, waiting, and when Grandpa passed, she made her move. 3 weeks after the landscaping scam, a process server crunched across the gravel with a lien notice. 23 grand now with interest. She'd scheduled a sheriff's sale. I had 30 days to stop my family's legacy from being stolen, but I'm not the rolling over type. I dug through public records and found gold. Over 5 years, Margaret had sold multiple HOA properties to her family, each for pennies on the dollar. Nephews, in-laws, cousins. She was using HOA rules as a real estate scam, so I fired back, filed complaints, documented everything, publicly. Her response? Pure panic. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, pushed my sheriff's sale up to 2 weeks, and claimed I was endangering the community. The minutes read like a soap opera script. But here's what Margaret didn't count on. She thought I was just some overwhelmed heir. She didn't know my grandfather worked for the FBI. I found out when I opened a waterlogged box Bradley had tossed into the rain. Inside were old letters, marked federal property, from the FBI. Dated, signed, legit. One letter from 1987, the exact year Margaret claimed Grandpa signed into the HOA, stated that the cabin had federal protection status for operational security. FBI language for hands off. I made a call to the Detroit field office, told them my grandfather's name, agent number. And the moment I said Agent Patterson, everything changed. They transferred me, verified documents. Then she called. Me personally, Agent Sarah Patterson, retired now, but still sharp. She remembered Grandpa. Walter was one of our most reliable civilian assets, she said. That cabin was a secure meeting location for 35 years. We still have a federal easement on file. That easement meant one thing. The cabin wasn't just mine. It was federal land, and Margaret had just trespassed on the FBI. She had no idea what was coming next. It didn't matter that I had the federal government on the line, not yet. Because when I returned to the cabin the next morning, it was too late. A dented red pickup was already in the driveway. The porch creaked under the weight of Bradley's. Girlfriend, tattoos on her cheeks, a cigarette in her mouth, and one of my grandfather's flannel shirts on her back. She gave me the kind of look you'd give to a stray dog wandering into your yard. Bradley stepped out next, rubbing his eyes like he'd just woken up. A beer in one hand, his other hand pointing toward me like he was announcing a game show contestant. Sorry. Big guy. This is our place now. And in that moment, my blood turned to ice. Not because of the smugness, not because they'd tossed Grandpa's medals in the trash, but because the sheriff's sale had already happened. 2 days early. No. Public notice. No posted flyer. Just 3 people. Margaret, Bradley, and some slick-haired guy in a suit, gathering quietly on the county courthouse steps and handing over my family's cabin for $24,000. $24,000. For a place worth $400,000. That's how Margaret played the game. Use the HOA to manufacture debt, push a fake lien, hold a secret sheriff's auction, and transfer the deed to her son while the real owner was away dealing with life. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the cabin had been part of a covert FBI program, still protected, still under federal easement, and she'd just broken about 6 laws with a single signature. Still, the law doesn't move fast just because you're angry, or grieving, or standing outside your stolen home while your grandfather's American flag is being used as a car rag. No, the law needs paperwork, process, precision, which is where Rebecca Martinez came in. HOA attorney, sharp tongue, sharper, brain. She didn't take corrupt board members to court. She dragged them there by the collar. Her first move? Tear apart the sheriff's sale. And she did. Turns out, Margaret's legal notice had been published in a tiny weekly newspaper, halfway across the county in the classifieds, next to ads for psychic readings and rabbit cages. According to state law, foreclosure notices had to be published in the paper with the widest circulation, not the one owned by your cousin with a typewriter and a dream. Rebecca filed an emergency injunction, and for one fleeting moment, I thought it was over, that we had her. Then Margaret sent her next gift, a thick manila envelope, hand-delivered, no return address. Inside, a single page, yellowed just enough to look aged. Dated 1987, signed by Walter Kowalski. Notarized, a voluntary agreement to join the Whispering Pines HOA in full compliance with all future rules, assessments, and penalties. My hands shook. My stomach sank. For a moment I questioned everything. I knew about Grandpa, but that's the thing about predators. They don't just steal your property. They try to rewrite your history. The judge reviewed the document, valid-looking. Notary seal intact, signature matching Walter's driver's license, temporary restraining order granted. I was officially banned from approaching my own property while the courts sorted it out. And Margaret? She used that window to escalate. In just 48 hours, she filed 5 separate police reports accusing me of stalking, intimidation, and terrorizing the community. Her story. I was an unstable veteran with violent tendencies, suffering from PTSD and possibly armed. It was character assassination, strategic, deliberate, and cruel. Whispers turned to rumors. Rumors turned to avoidance. The grocery store clerk stopped making eye contact. The gas station attendant slid my change across the counter like I was contagious. Margaret didn't just steal my cabin, she'd hijacked my identity. But here's the part that broke her plan wide open. Murphy's Diner. That's where I met them. The other victims. I called for an informal gathering, neighbors, friends, anyone who had questions. Over coffee that tasted like battery acid and pancakes that could stop a bullet, people started talking. The Hendersons. Their deck was non-compliant a week after complaining about HOA budget changes. The Patels. Thousands in fines for cultural flags in their garden that Margaret called clutter. Mr. Peterson. 83 years old. Margaret tried to make him tear down his wife's wheelchair ramp because it wasn't aesthetic. Everyone had a story. And a common enemy. But it was the anonymous envelope slipped under my napkin that turned the tide. No note. Just a copy of Bradley's probation paperwork. Address listed, Margaret's house. Not the cabin. Meaning the moment Bradley moved into my grandfather's property, he violated his probation. His parole officer had no idea where he was living. I made a single call. Officer Williams. Calm, efficient, and not at all pleased to hear that his parolee was squatting on federal property. The next day, Bradley was officially labeled non-compliant. Warrant pending. Status, fugitive. But we weren't done, because buried in the wet cardboard boxes Margaret had thrown out, I found something else. A thin folder, labeled FBI Civilian Asset Program. Inside, letters, official stationery, typed in the stilted language of federal correspondence, dates ranging from 1960 to 1995. They weren't warnings or investigations. They were thank yous, payment vouchers, operation logs, all referencing Walter's cabin as a secure meeting location for surveillance activities tied to organized crime. One letter, dated 1987, the same year Margaret claimed Walter signed into the HOA, stood out. Signed by Special Agent Sarah Patterson, it confirmed continued use of federal facilities maintained by civilian asset Walter Kowalski for national security operations. Translation? There was zero chance my grandfather voluntarily joined the HOA that year. He was actively housing federal agents. And under federal protection status, I called the Detroit field office again, gave them the contractor ID. Within 20 minutes, Agent Patterson was on the line. Retired now, but her memory? Razor sharp. "I remember Walter," she said. "One of the best. That cabin of his? We used it for meetings, exchanges, and safe housing. It's on record with the Bureau. Still under an inactive federal easement. Still protected, still off limits." The next morning she drove down. Black SUV, federal credentials, coffee in hand. We met at Murphy's. When she walked in, the entire diner went silent. She reviewed every document, every signature, every envelope, and when she was done, she looked at me and said, "Margaret just messed with the wrong people. Rebecca, Agent Patterson, and I formed a triangle of retaliation. Rebecca pursued Margaret's fraudulent lien citing 17 violations, from improper notice to forged documents. Patterson reopened federal interest, activating the easement clause that instantly invalidated any local claim, and then came Daniel Kim. Investigative journalist. Quiet, observant, dangerous in the best way. He'd been following HOA corruption cases for years. When he heard about federal property, military families, and real estate fraud, he showed up at my door with 2 cameras and a hunger for blood. "I'm going to bury her in pixels," he said. We gave him everything: interviews, documents, photos, security footage. But what mattered most was community testimony. Frank, the Vietnam vet from American Legion Post 112, called a meeting. Over 20 families showed up, each with photos, records, letters, all showing a decade-long pattern of abuse. Betty, VFW Auxiliary President, had the final nail. She'd filed a public records request and discovered that Margaret had embezzled over $80,000 from HOA accounts, paying her brother's fake landscaping company, her son's non-existent security business, and even billing the HOA for legal consultations related to her personal lawsuits. That's when the strategy locked in. Federal, legal, public. Rebecca would shred the HOA in court. Patterson would push the federal investigation. Daniel would light Margaret up in the press. And me, I'd make damn sure every camera I installed around the cabin captured everything. Because the next time Margaret made a move, she'd be doing it on federal film. Margaret thought this was still about some lakeside cabin. She had no idea she was about to go to war with a veteran's legacy, the United States government, and an entire community ready to take back their neighborhood. She'd stolen property, spread lies, falsified documents, and now she'd trespassed on federal ground. The line had been crossed, and justice was about to knock. The first time Margaret realized something was wrong, it wasn't in court or in a lawyer's office. It was at her favorite nail salon, of all places. She walked in like she always did, like she owned the building, the parking lot, and probably the air itself. But this time, the receptionist didn't greet her. A man in uniform stepped aside to let her through, and 2 women at the drying station fell silent as she passed, because the rumors had started to spread that Margaret Thornfield, Queen of Whispering Pines, was no longer untouchable, that the HOA wasn't just being challenged, it was being investigated by people with badges, subpoenas, and old debts to settle. And none of that sat well with Margaret, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. Within days, she hired a private investigator, Rex Bulldozer Korvinsky. a washed-up fraud specialist with a beat-up Camaro and enough body spray to knock out a moose. His mission? Prove that I was the unstable, dangerous veteran she claimed I was, and he didn't even try to hide it. Neighbors started calling me. "Hey, Jack, there's this guy sitting outside Murphy's with a giant camera lens pointed at the door." Another said, "He asked if you were violent, if you owned firearms. Said he was doing a risk profile." He parked 2 cars down from the VFW, took pictures of me walking into the post like I was smuggling nuclear codes. He even tailed Agent Patterson back to her hotel until she made a call and a state. Trooper followed him home instead. Rex wasn't a threat. He was a symptom of Margaret's growing desperation, because while she was playing games, we were building a fortress of truth. Daniel Kim's investigative series had just dropped its first article. Title, "The HOA Queen and the FBI Cabin." It exploded. Local. News picked it up. Veterans organizations shared it nationwide. Reddit threads lit up like wildfire. People came forward from other states saying they'd lost homes to HOAs that operated just like Margaret's. The comments weren't just outraged. They were organized. Margaret had awakened something bigger than a lawsuit. She'd poked a national nerve, and still she refused to stop. She filed motions to delay hearings, accused the court of bias, even tried to disqualify Agent Patterson as a compromised witness. Her lawyers submitted bizarre claims about federal hoaxes and forged documents, until Rebecca Martinez calmly handed them the FBI authentication letter and smiled like a woman who had brought a bazooka to a pillow fight. But Margaret's most pathetic move came next. She tried to bribe the county clerk, offered him $5,000 cash to discover a lost document, proving the HOA had jurisdiction over the property before 1956. A total impossibility, since the HOA didn't exist until 1996, but might. She didn't know? The clerk recorded the entire conversation, her voice, her offer, her threat. "This little problem could disappear," she whispered, "if you knew where to look." That recording went straight to the district attorney's office. And now, Margaret's file wasn't just thick with HOA violations. It had crossed into felony territory, and then, just when we thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Agent Patterson called me on a Tuesday morning. Her tone was steady, but I could tell she was angry. Furious, actually. "You need to see this footage," she said. They had been quietly monitoring the property, reviewing the feeds from the security cameras I'd installed, and they'd caught Bradley, on tape, running a drug operation. Small scale, sure, but still. Controlled substances, baggy handoffs, cash in envelopes, all of it, right there on my grandfather's front porch, with his girlfriend playing lookout. Even worse, some of his customers were already on federal watch lists. That cabin wasn't just being squatted in, it was being used as a distribution hub on federal property. Within hours, the Bureau assigned a task force. Marshals were prepped. Local authorities were advised to step aside. And Margaret? She had no clue any of it was happening. She was too busy calling another HOA board meeting in her own living room, because apparently the community center had scheduling conflicts. Her 4 loyal board members sat there like extras in a community theater play. Hairdresser Linda, bait shop Dave, brother-in-law Tom, and Margaret, sweating through her silk blouse, declaring emergency HOA powers like she was passing federal legislation. They voted unanimously to give Margaret retroactive authority over all properties within their map boundaries. And even more hilariously, they voted to grant themselves immunity from future lawsuits. Rebecca had a copy of the meeting minutes within 12 hours, and she laughed so hard she spilled her coffee. On her keyboard, they just confessed to the entire scam, in writing. Meanwhile, I kept documenting everything. My cameras caught Bradley tagging the shed with graffiti, Margaret sneaking onto the porch and replacing HOA violation notices with new ones every morning like it was a ritual. And the best part? One night, Rex, the PI, was caught planting evidence in my garbage. A pill bottle, a burned photo, a note with threatening handwriting that he later discovered while snooping, all on camera. By now, Daniel Kim was sitting on a journalistic gold mine. Embezzlement, fraud, abuse of power, federal property violations, character assassination, drug trafficking. And still, Margaret thought she could talk her way out of it. That's when she staged her final PR stunt, a driveway press conference. She set up a few folding chairs in front of her garage, printed some cheap flyers, and invited every reporter she could find. 3 people showed up. One was from a coupon magazine. Another might have been her cousin with a smartphone. The third was Daniel Kim. He showed up with a camera rig and a notepad and caught every second. Margaret took the makeshift podium and started ranting. She claimed I was a fake veteran, that the FBI documents were deep fakes. That Agent Patterson was my secret girlfriend working to help me steal the HOA's assets. She called it a federal land scam conspiracy. When Daniel asked to see her proof, she waved photocopied forms from the 80s that were clearly printed on modern paper. Then she demanded he stop filming because she hadn't given permission on a public street, at her own event. Daniel smiled and said, "Thanks for confirming everything." Later that evening, Agent Patterson called with one more bombshell. They had traced Margaret's online behavior, multiple fake Facebook profiles, dozens of anonymous posts, spreading lies about me, about other neighbors, even about Rebecca Martinez. She'd created a Facebook page called Whispering Pine Safety Alert and filled it with terrifying stories about the unstable veteran lurking in the shadows. Her favorite method? Making comments from fake accounts she controlled, pretending to be terrified citizens. Names like Worried Mama 47 and Patriot Dad 2. But federal agencies don't just track actions, they track IP addresses. They had it all. Every post, every login, every fake identity. That night, Agent Patterson said something I'll never forget. She could have just stopped. Could have apologized, but some people need to burn the whole village down trying to win the smallest war. And the war, it was coming to a close. Margaret had no idea the federal marshals were getting their gear ready. That Rebecca had filed a full civil case with RICO implications. That Daniel Kim had submitted his series for a journalism award. That the FBI's Office of Public Affairs had drafted a statement verifying Walter Kowalski's 35 years of covert service, or that I'd already spoken to the mayor about reforming the HOA laws statewide, because this wasn't about a cabin anymore. It was about every family she ever targeted. And soon, the whole town was going to know the truth. You could feel it in the air, like pressure before a storm. A kind of collective tension building in every neighbor's glance, every sideways whisper at the diner. Margaret thought she could out-talk, out-lie, and out-threaten anyone in her path. But what she never saw coming was that the entire neighborhood was waking up, and she was the reason. It started with the flyers. One morning, every windshield along Whispering Pines was covered in bright orange papers with a bold headline, "Dangerous Veteran Threatens Community Safety." My face, my official military photo from my time overseas, was front and center. But this wasn't about honoring service. No, it was twisted. Bullet points claimed I had violent tendencies, a history of threats, and was impersonating federal agents to intimidate innocent residents. She listed fake charges, distorted my deployments into signs of instability, and even claimed I'd menaced a child at the bus stop. That last one made my jaw lock so hard I thought I might snap a tooth. But it wasn't just flyers. She launched a Facebook page, Whispering Pine Safety Alert. It had exactly one admin, Margaret. Using 5 fake accounts to post fabricated witness accounts of me lurking near garages, throwing rocks at cars, and threatening elderly neighbors. You could practically hear her cackling behind the keyboard. Names like Concerned Mom 88 and Golf Cart Patriot started appearing in the comments, warning others about that Kowalski guy and his violent past. Of course, all of them traced back to the same IP, Margaret's IP. Daniel Kim was screenshotting everything. Timestamps, usernames, metadata. The receipts were piling up so high the truth couldn't be buried anymore. But Margaret wasn't done. She started showing up, in person, at local businesses. She told the hardware store owner that I threatened to blow up the HOA office, warned the diner waitresses that I might snap one day, whispered to the gas station attendant that I was hiding military-grade weapons in the woods. Each time she lowered her voice just enough to make it seem secret, important, urgent. It was masterful, and it was crumbling. Because across town, Agent Patterson wasn't just reviewing the property claim anymore. She was digging deep into Margaret's finances, into Bradley's record, into every real estate deal the HOA had touched over the past decade. And what she found? It wasn't just shady, it was federal criminal. Turns out Margaret had been researching federal easement properties across 3 counties, looking for ones that were inactive, ones where the owners had died, ones with heirs out of state. She had a list, and Walter Kowalski's name had been circled for years. She'd tried the same stunt on 2 other families. One had hired a pricey lawyer and scared her off. The other settled out of court. But me? She thought I was just some tired vet with no backup. And that was her fatal mistake. Because by now, the FBI had reopened interest in the property, triggered by the 1987 Patterson letter stating that the cabin remained part of a secure federal operations site. Even if that easement was inactive, it hadn't been revoked, and interfering with such a site? That was obstruction, tampering, fraud, all the sheriffs, all the board meetings, all the fake documents. Suddenly, Margaret was sitting in a hurricane of her own making, and then came the town hall meeting. It wasn't even supposed to be about her. Mayor Davidson had called it to discuss the annual 4th of July festival budget. But Margaret demanded speaking time. She said the community needed to be warned about the growing conspiracy taking root in their own neighborhood. I didn't plan to go, but Frank from the American Legion insisted. Betty brought cookies. Mr. Peterson, despite needing a walker, got there early to save me a seat. And when I stepped into the Whispering Pines Community Center that Thursday night, I froze. 7 people. Standing room only, the biggest turnout in the town's history. Veterans, moms, old-timers who remembered my grandfather. Even a few of the teenagers who'd once avoided my eyes showed up. The smell of burnt percolator coffee hung in the air. Someone had tried to put out extra chairs, but they ran out. This wasn't just a meeting. This was Judgment Day. Margaret arrived late, flanked by her remaining board members, Linda the hairdresser, Dave the bait shop guy, and her brother-in-law, Tom, none of whom looked particularly thrilled to be there. She wore her most expensive pantsuit, makeup layered like armor, and her eyes twitchy, desperate. She walked to the podium with the confidence of a woman who'd never lost a fight, and then she opened her mouth. "This community is under attack," she began, "by a dangerous individual with a record of violence and a trail of lawsuits, a man who claims to be protected by the FBI, but who is really here to sow chaos." Gasps. Not the supportive kind. She held up more flyers. Blew up photos of my grandfathers, FBI correspondence, and called them poorly made forgeries. Walter Kowalski, she said, was a communist sympathizer who infiltrated government programs for his own gain. That's when the first voice cut through. "Excuse me," said Mrs. Chen, standing slowly from the back. "Are you saying a Purple Heart recipient who served in Korea was a traitor?" Silence. You could hear the HVAC humming. Margaret tried to recover. Just because someone served doesn't mean they're above the law. This man, his grandson, is trying to steal property that legally belongs to this HOA. That's when another voice interrupted. "Let me clarify something about those federal connections." Agent Patterson stood, her badge in one hand, her FBI ID in the other. Her voice calm, powerful. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Patterson, and I worked with Walter Kowalski for over 30 years. He was one of our most trusted civilian assets. His property was used in national security operations that remain classified to this day." The crowd went still. Margaret took a step back. Agent Patterson walked slowly to the podium, laid the easement letter on top of Margaret's flyers, and continued. "The federal easement on the Kowalski property has never been revoked. Any sale, occupancy, or interference with that land is a federal offense. Furthermore, our investigation into illegal HOA activity is ongoing," Margaret stammered. This is entrapment. This is fraud." Patterson cut her off. "That 1987 HOA agreement you've been waving around? We had it analyzed. The paper was manufactured in 2019. The notary listed died in 1995. The ink is 6 months old, and your fingerprints are all over it." That was the moment the back doors opened. 2 federal marshals stepped inside, one by the aisle, one by the exit, calm, controlled. No weapons drawn, but their presence was unmistakable. Margaret turned. "This isn't over. You can't do this. You can't—" "Ma'am," said one of the marshals. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, obstruction, and conspiracy to interfere with federal property. You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs clicked. Margaret's board members quietly melted into the background. Daniel Kim's camera captured every second, and when the crowd finally erupted, it wasn't chaos. It was relief, applause, cheers. Some people cried. I just stood there frozen, watching 40 years of scheming unravel in a single evening. Frank stepped up and took the mic. "It's about damn time someone stood up to these HOA bullies," he said. "Walter Kowalski would be proud." And just like that, Margaret's kingdom fell. But the story wasn't over yet. Because now that the lies were exposed and the cuffs were locked, it was time to rebuild something better and honor the legacy Margaret tried so hard to bury. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was worried. Those days were over. But because I couldn't stop playing it back. The sound of the handcuffs, the silence when Agent Patterson said the word classified, the look on Margaret's face when she finally realized her years of schemes, lies, and manipulation had met their reckoning. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just reacting to Margaret Thornfield's chaos. I was standing on the other side of it. And now, It was our turn to rebuild. By morning, the fallout had already begun. Margaret's arrest hit every local news outlet like a lightning bolt. Daniel Kim's article, "The HOA Queen Who Crossed the FBI," went viral. Local papers picked it up, then national veterans groups, then a federal watchdog blog that pulled no punches. Within 24 hours, Margaret's real estate license had been suspended pending investigation, her bank accounts frozen, and the FBI had issued a press release confirming the legitimacy of the federal easement on the Kowalski property, that little piece of land she'd tried to steal for $24,000, now officially untouchable. But that wasn't even the end of it, because Bradley, her precious son, was already in handcuffs of his own. Turns out the marshals didn't just serve Margaret, they'd stopped by the cabin, too. Security footage showed Bradley trying to flush a shoebox full of pills down the toilet, unsuccessfully. Another clip showed him arguing with his girlfriend over who gets blamed for what. When the marshals came through the door, they found more than drugs. They found transaction logs. He'd been running a low-level operation, sure, but some of the names on those logs raised more than eyebrows. One of them was on a federal watch list. Another had a sealed record that triggered automatic alerts. And just like that, the cabin became a crime scene. Federal agents cordoned off the entire property. They cataloged every box, every item left behind. Rebecca Martinez and Agent Patterson both called me personally that afternoon. "You're going to want gloves when you go back in." They weren't wrong. 3 days later, the cabin was officially released back into my possession. I pulled up the driveway slowly, headlights cutting through the early morning mist. It felt like stepping into a ghost story, only the ghosts weren't memories. They were the trash bags on the porch, the stained mattresses dragged out of the guest room, the blackout curtains still hanging like funeral drapes in Grandpa's living room, and the smell. Like energy drinks, mold, and bitter resentment. I took a long breath, then walked through the front door. My grandfather's flannel was still there, on the hook by the fireplace, covered in dust. His fishing hat, too, crumpled in the corner. Like it had been tossed and forgotten. The couch was missing a leg. The floor had cigarette burns. The kitchen? They'd left open containers in the fridge. There was a full rotting pizza box with a half-burned joint sitting on top. But the worst of it? The photos were gone. All those framed moments, Grandpa and me on the dock, his Korean War medals, Mom at age 6 holding a sparkler on the 4th of July, gone, torn, dumped. I found them later in a damp cardboard box in the back shed, buried under bags of stolen tools and spray paint, and I stood there for a long time. Not angry, not sad, just quiet. Because as much as they'd tried to erase our history, they'd failed. The cabin still stood, and it was still ours. I called in a few favors. Frank from the Legion, Betty from the VFW, even Mr. Peterson brought over some plywood and a hammer. And for the next 2 weeks, we restored that cabin. Every nail we drove in felt like reclaiming something. Every board replaced, every surface scrubbed, every trash bag hauled out was an act of rebellion against what Margaret had tried to take. We replaced the broken porch swing with a new one carved by a local vet named Carlos, rehung every photo, refinished the kitchen counters, painted over every tag and message Bradley had left behind like it meant something. And on the fireplace mantel we placed Walter's Purple Heart, centered under an American flag folded crisp and sharp, One morning, Agent Patterson dropped by with a sealed envelope. Inside, the original easement letter, stamped, signed, framed, and notarized by the Bureau. "Hang this somewhere visible," she said, "just in case someone else gets ideas." We laughed, but her eyes held something more serious. "Jack," she said quietly, "there are people out there who wait their whole lives to feel this kind of justice. Most never do. What you did, it mattered. Not just for you, for everyone she ever hurt." She was right, because that very week something strange started happening. 4 other HOA boards in the county voluntarily announced reforms to their bylaws: homeowner protections, transparency rules, new ethics guidelines. Why? Because they didn't want to be the next Whispering Pines. Rebecca's phone rang nonstop. Veterans across the country were reaching out, asking how to fight similar battles in their own towns. Some even drove across state lines to attend our next VFW meeting. And me? I established the Walter Kowalski Memorial Fund, funded by the settlement. Check Margaret's insurance company had quietly written once the civil lawsuits began. The fund now helps military families fight HOA harassment and provides legal aid for property disputes. It's not just a tribute, it's a message. This isn't just a cabin, it's a stand. It's a promise that people like Margaret won't get, to operate unchecked ever again. And something unexpected came from it all, too. The community changed. Neighbors who used to avoid me now brought casseroles. The Patels brought over new prayer flags and helped us hang them by the dock. The Hendersons offered to rebuild the old boathouse that collapsed 2 winters ago. Even Mr. Peterson, cane and all, came to every vet meeting we hosted. The cabin became what my grandfather always meant it to be, a sanctuary. A place to gather, to remember, to fight from if needed, but more importantly, to heal. Daniel Kim's story series eventually won him a regional journalism award. His final installment was titled The Cabin That Broke the HOA Cartel. He dedicated it to my grandfather. Agent Patterson retired officially, but not quietly. She became a guest speaker at veteran advocacy events, always ending with this line. Sometimes, patriotism isn't loud. It's just a man keeping a cabin ready for people who need a place to meet in secret. And every time she said it, she'd smile. I'd smile too, because I knew that cabin. I knew that man, and I knew now, after everything Margaret had tried to do, that justice isn't just about law. It's about memory, about standing in a place someone tried to take from you and breathing freely again. Next month, we were hosting the first Veterans and Neighbors BBQ on the newly restored dock. Kids would be fishing. Frank had offered to man the grill. Betty was bringing her famous coleslaw, and me, I was going to sit on that porch swing and watch the sunset hit Mirror Lake just like Grandpa used to. Maybe even wear his old fishing hat. Because this story wasn't just about tearing down a tyrant. It was about building something better in her place. Something worth keeping. Something no one could ever steal again. The thing about justice is that it doesn't always come in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives in quiet meetings, in unsigned bills, in the way people walk into a room and look at you differently. Sometimes it comes in waves that ripple far beyond what you ever imagined. 2 weeks after Margaret was arrested, something strange happened in the state capitol. A bill was introduced, the Homeowner Protection Act. It proposed mandatory transparency for HOA budgets, clear limits on fines, legal rights for homeowners facing fraudulent liens, and above all, it required external oversight for any HOA attempting to foreclose on property. Daniel Kim broke the story first. The legislation had been drafted by a small team of state lawmakers, none of whom had ever met me, but who had followed Daniel's series and decided it was time. One representative called the Kowalski story a national embarrassment hiding in plain sight. Another said, "This isn't just about HOAs. It's about unchecked power wrapped in bureaucracy." The bill had bipartisan support, unanimous committee approval, and Margaret's name, it came up in every hearing. Her face, smiling smugly from old HOA newsletters, became the symbol of exactly what needed to change. But back home in Whispering Pines, change was taking a different shape. The old board was gone. Every one of Margaret's cronies had either resigned or vanished. No one wanted to be the last holdout when the subpoenas arrived. A temporary receiver was appointed by the court, and the first thing he did was hold a public meeting in the old community center. I didn't plan to attend, but I did, out of curiosity, out of duty, out of the strange pull that happens when the place that tried to destroy you is finally asking what to do next. The room looked different this time. Less crowded, less tense, but more honest. The receiver, a soft-spoken attorney named Marla, opened with a simple statement. "This HOA will no longer operate in fear. We are here to fix, not control, to serve, not punish." Then she opened the floor and the floodgates. Mrs. Chen was the first to speak. "We were afraid," she said. "We knew it wasn't right, but we didn't know how to stop her." The Hendersons shared their finds. The Patels talked about the pain of being made to feel foreign in their own yard. Mr. Peterson brought a photo of his wife and the ramp he'd been told to tear down. Each story landed like a pebble dropped in a still lake. You could feel the ripples across every row of folding chairs. Then Marla turned to me. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, "we know this shouldn't have happened, and we'd like to ask your permission to name you as our community liaison for HOA reform." I didn't have to think. "No," I said. The room blinked. A few heads turned. I stood slowly, looked around, met every eye I could. "I don't want a title," I said. "I want a community. One where veterans aren't smeared, where widows aren't harassed, where families don't lose their homes to paperwork games. You don't need a liaison. You need a memory. A long one." And I walked out. Not angry, just done. Because I wasn't interested in rebuilding power structures. I was interested in something more permanent, and it started at the lake. That weekend, we held the first official Veterans Community cleanup. Frank brought volunteers from 6 neighboring towns. Betty handed out maps. Daniel Kim filmed the whole thing, and even Mayor Davidson showed up with gloves and a rake. We pulled 3 tons of trash from the shoreline. Kids worked alongside grandpas. A Korean War vet named Ted taught a group of teens how to tie boating knots. Carlos carved names into a new memorial bench using an old chisel set from his Marine days. Someone even brought a grill, and under the setting sun, people stayed, talked, laughed, ate like a real neighborhood. That night I stood at the edge of the dock, coffee in hand. Shirt dusty, boots muddy, muscles sore in a way that felt earned. And I looked back at the cabin. The lights inside were warm, the photos back on the wall. The silence, the good kind, settled around the lake like a blanket. Agent Patterson called. Me just after midnight, she'd been watching the press roll in. Margaret's mugshot was now on federal court documents. Her trial date was set. The charges had expanded. Mail fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, embezzlement, perjury, and conspiracy to commit property theft on a federally Protected site. Bradley had taken a plea deal. 6 months in county jail, 2 years probation, and mandatory drug treatment. He wasn't fighting it, because even he knew the tide had turned. Patterson told me something else. "Jack," she said, "we're adding your grandfather's cabin to the Federal Archive. Not as active property, but as a recognized intelligence. Location. We're preserving it. As history." I didn't speak for a long time. "Thank you," I finally said, and I meant it, because what Margaret tried to turn into a footnote was now part of the record, permanently. The next week, I got a letter from Mrs. Chen, handwritten, scented with tea leaves. Inside was a copy of an old survey map, dated 1983. It showed her property line, my grandfather's, and the sliver of land. Harold Thornfield, the original family grudge holder, had tried to steal. She'd saved it all these years. "I always knew this would come back around," she wrote. "Your grandfather was right to fight back. So were you." The last page was a photo, a snapshot from the 80s. Grandpa smiling with his arm around Mrs. Chen's late husband, both men muddy from digging, grinning like boys on a fishing trip. Taped it inside the kitchen cabinet, right next to the coffee mugs. Some things don't need to be on the wall. They just need to be close. That month, donations started flowing into the Walter Kowalski Memorial Fund, not just from locals, from all over the country. People who'd read the story, watched Daniel's series, veterans who'd lost property, families who had nowhere to turn, and we helped them, one by one. Small cases, big cases, HOA nightmares that sounded too absurd to be true, until you read the paperwork. Rebecca Martinez stayed on board, handling legal filings. Frank coordinated the network of veteran volunteers who would show up for court hearings and cleanups. Betty handled logistics with the efficiency of a military general. And me? I stayed at the cabin, kept the firewood stacked, hosted the meetings, made the coffee. Every Tuesday we had open hours. Anyone with a story could stop by. Tell it. Cry. Vent. Get help. Because that's what justice turns into when the courtroom doors close. It becomes service. It becomes legacy. And one foggy morning, as I sat on the dock watching the mist lift off the lake, a boy about 8 years old walked up. With his mom, he pointed at the flag over the cabin. "Did a real hero live there?" he asked. I smiled. "No," I said. "He just built it. But a lot of heroes came through." He nodded solemnly, then ran off to join the other kids dragging branches from the woods. And I thought to myself, maybe that's what winning looks like. Not headlines, not trophies, not even court rulings. Just a little boy, safe, free, and curious, on a dock that someone once tried to steal and didn't. The courthouse smelled like old carpet and tension. Margaret's trial wasn't on the front page anymore. The world had moved on. But inside that oak-paneled courtroom, every second felt like history writing itself with a gavel. She wore gray. Not her usual sharp navy or deep red. Her hair no longer styled to intimidate. Her eyes hollow, darting behind reading glasses that seemed more costume than correction. But her voice, still the same, snapping at her attorney, scoffing at the court clerk, giving sideways glares to Agent Patterson and Rebecca Martinez, seated, quietly 2 rows behind me. I sat with Frank, Betty, Mrs. Chen, and a few other neighbors who'd refused to be intimidated by her ever again. Daniel Kim was tucked near the back, scribbling notes, the glow of his recorder quietly blinking. The judge began with the formal charges: fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to interfere with federal property, wire fraud, mail fraud, falsification of public records, and one that felt almost poetic, defamation of a federal assets family. Margaret's defense? That she didn't know the property was under federal protection, that she had been misled by faulty documentation, that it was all a misunderstanding born from civic responsibility. Rebecca rose at that moment, calm, precise. She handed the judge a flash drive containing security footage of Margaret coaching Bradley on how to fabricate the 1987 HOA agreement. Another showing her slipping flyers onto windshields in the dead of night using gloves. A third showing her laughing about the old coot finally dying to one of her board members. Silence fell in the courtroom like a dropped pane of glass, but the moment that changed everything wasn't caught on camera. It came from a witness no one expected. A woman in her late 60s, neatly dressed, nervous. Her name, Dolores Mathis. She took the stand, hands trembling. "I worked with Margaret at Thornfield Realty in the 90s, she said. "We were close, or I thought we were." She paused, until she told me something about her father. You could feel the room lean forward. Harold Thornfield. He tried to buy a piece of lakefront land in 1983 from a Korean War veteran named Walter Kowalski. Got denied. Publicly, the county ruled against him. Dolores swallowed hard. He never got over it. Talked about that property for years. Told Margaret that land should have been theirs. Called Walter names. Said he cheated the system. Her voice softened, and Margaret believed him. She told me in 2001, "Someday, I'll make sure my family gets what should have been ours." There it was, not just a scam, not just a crime, but a 40-year grudge passed down like a family heirloom. Suddenly, all of it made sense. The obsession. The forged documents, the relentless character assassinations. This wasn't about HOA rules. It was about revenge. The courtroom went still. The judge took a breath, then ruled guilty on all counts. Sentencing, 3 to 5 years in federal prison, restitution, loss of her license, permanent ban from serving on any HOA board, immediate transfer to custody. Margaret didn't say a word as the marshals took her by the arms, didn't scream, didn't cry. But just before they led her through the door, she turned back. Her eyes locked with mine, and for the first time, I saw fear, not of me, but of what it meant that she'd lost. Because people like Margaret don't fear prison. They fear irrelevance. Afterward, we walked out into bright sunlight that felt different, like the air itself had been cleared. Agent Patterson shook my hand. "It's done," she said. "No," I replied. "Now it begins. Because justice is never the end. It's just the start of what you build next." 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the Department of Justice. Inside was something I hadn't expected. An official commendation, not military, not FBI, just a small embossed certificate that read, "In recognition of civilian courage, in defense of federal property, community integrity, and public truth." Signed by the Deputy Director of the Bureau. I didn't hang it on the wall. I slid it into the same folder as my grandfather's FBI correspondence and tucked it into the cabin safe. Because what we were doing wasn't for awards, it was for continuity. That summer, the Kowalski cabin became more than just a meeting space. Added a flagpole. Put up a small plaque near the dock, marking it as a historical location. Daniel Kim arranged for a small documentary crew to come film interviews with veterans who had passed through there over the decades. And every month, the Veteran Family Legal Network hosted seminars at the cabin, teaching families how to defend their property from rogue HOAs, giving them tools, resources, and most importantly, hope. One day, a woman named Mrs. Gutierrez came from Arizona. Her husband had served in Vietnam. Her HOA tried to fine her $11,000 for yard violations while she was attending his funeral. She didn't cry when she told her story, but I did, because hers was the kind of pain that doesn't show up on paper. 2 weeks later, Rebecca had filed suit on her behalf. 3 months after that, the Arizona legislature was debating its own version of the Homeowner Protection Act. It was working. The ripples were growing, and then, on a cool October morning, I received one final gift. A padded envelope. No return address. Just my name. Inside, a cassette tape, a note, and a photo. The photo was of my grandfather. In front of the cabin. 1987, standing next to Agent Sarah Patterson. Both of them younger, alert, smiling in the kind of way you only smile when you know exactly what you're doing and who you're protecting. The note was written in her hand. Jack. Found this while sorting out old records. You should have it. Walter would have wanted you to hear it. Sarah. I scrambled to find an old tape player. The recording was grainy. Faint. But I knew the voice the second I heard it. My grandfather. If something ever happens, and they come for this place, you tell them, this cabin isn't just a building. It's a shield, built for good men and good work. I don't care what HOA or real estate lady thinks she runs the neighborhood. This land serves a bigger purpose, and no paperwork scam's gonna change that. Then silence, followed by Sarah's voice. Younger, sharper. Understood, Walter. We'll keep the paperwork filed and quiet. If they try, we'll remind them what it's tied to. I rewound it and played it again and again. Because somehow decades ago they knew this fight would come, and they trusted someone, me, to win it. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat by the fire, tape recorder beside me, listening to my grandfather's voice as the lake wind whispered through the pines outside. And when the sun rose, I made a quiet promise. This place would always stay ready. Not just for me, but for the next person who needed it, because justice never ends with one case. It passes on, quietly, fiercely, unbroken, like a cabin by the lake waiting. Sometimes it's the quiet that gets you, not the kind after a storm or an argument, but the kind where nothing's pressing. No more lawsuits, no more threats taped to your door, no agents waiting outside with files or subpoenas. Just quiet. It had been 6 months since Margaret was sentenced. The headlines had faded. The HOA had fully dissolved. And Bradley, from what I heard, was holding down a landscaping job in a neighboring town. Kept to himself. Didn't talk about the cabin. That was fine with me, because the cabin had its own story to tell. In November, I hosted something new, something simple, a bonfire, no flyers, no big announcements. Just a word passed from porch to porch, over fence, posts and grocery aisles. Come to the lake, bring a chair, no agenda. That night, 57 people showed up. Veterans, single moms, teens, retirees. People who hadn't spoken to one another in years. People who had once stood silent during Margaret's reign, now laughing, trading firewood, offering cups of soup and memories like currency. We circled around the flame. It popped and hissed, sparks reaching for the dark sky above. And then Frank asked a question. What's next? The crackle filled the pause. Everyone looked at me. I thought about it. Then I stood and answered simply, "We tell the truth." That's it. They waited. I added, that this land doesn't belong to fear, that property lines don't define humanity, that no piece of paper outweighs a person's dignity, that we remember what happened here so it doesn't happen again. Betty nodded slowly. Someone clapped. Someone else handed me a beer, and the fire kept burning. Later that week, I sat down with Daniel Kim for one last interview. He was closing the documentary series. Wanted one final quote to tie it all together. We sat on the porch swing my grandfather had built. He asked, "What would your grandfather say if he saw all this?" I didn't answer right away. The wind was carrying frost now. The lake shimmered. Under a pale sun, he'd probably say, I finally murmured, "Keep the coffee pot full and the doors unlocked." Daniel laughed, but he got it. This wasn't about cabins anymore. It was about safety, belonging, truth. Daniel's documentary was titled The Cabin That Fought Back. It won a regional award. A few national outlets picked it up, and not long after, a coalition of states passed a unified homeowner reform bill modeled after what we'd started. Turns out people were hungry for justice. They just needed a map. But the real reward was a letter I received one snowy December morning. No return address, just a typed page, folded neatly, smelled faintly of mint and old libraries. "Mr. Kowalski, I watched your story from across the country. My father was a veteran, served in Nam. Our HOA made his last years miserable. They fined us for a wheelchair ramp, then for his oxygen tank. I didn't know what to do back then, but I know now. I'm joining your network. I'm going to help others. You made us all braver. Thank you." I folded it gently and placed it in the same folder as the tape, the easement letter, and the commendation. A folder of things that mattered. That spring, we added something new to the cabin property. A trail. Just a short path through the pines, marked with wooden posts engraved with quotes, some from veterans, some from neighbors, some anonymous. At the end of the trail, a small wooden bench overlooked the lake. Carved into its backrest were the words, "Justice lives quietly like roots beneath the surface." People came from all over to sit, to think, to leave tokens on the bench, coins, patches, folded notes tucked beneath the slats. One note read, "I never thought anyone would believe me. Now I know they will." That's when I knew the story had done what it needed to do, not just expose corruption, but build something sacred in its place. And the final piece? It came unexpectedly. A phone call, blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to. A woman's voice. Raspy. Measured. "Mr. Kowalski?" "Yes." I'm Margaret's sister. I doubt you want to hear from me." I wouldn't. "Blame you? I didn't say anything," she continued. "She's not well. Prison was never something she expected. But I needed you to know. She talked about you. Not in anger. In regret. Real regret. She said you did what she couldn't, protected something with honesty. She said she didn't understand that kind of strength until it was too late." A pause. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should hear that." Another pause. Then she added, "She kept a copy of the flyer she made about you, the one she posted all over town, in her cell. Said it reminded her of what lies cost." The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, staring out the window, thinking not about Margaret, but about what that flyer had tried to erase. It hadn't succeeded, because the truth, once spoken enough times, starts to echo louder than any lie. Now, the cabin's still there, flag flying, porch swing creaking softly, smoke drifting from the chimney when meetings run late. Veterans come and go. Some stay for a weekend. Some just want to touch the wall where the photos hang. Others bring their children, teaching them what it means to stand their ground. And me? I just keep it running, keep the coffee hot, keep the lights on. Because somewhere out there, another family's fighting the same kind of battle. And they need to know the war can be won. That one cabin, one man, one memory can be enough to turn back a machine built on silence and intimidation. It doesn't take a badge or a gavel. It takes resolve. It takes truth told over and over until it becomes too loud to ignore. So when the wind picks up and the lake goes still, I listen. Because somewhere in that silence, I still hear my grandfather's voice. Keep it ready, son. You never know when someone's going to need a place to fight back from. And I always will.